Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We have a good number of folks that have joined today's webinar. Welcome. My name is Susan Dos-Reis. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy and director of the PACE Center located at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. Really excited to have you join us today for our second webinar in a three-part series. These webinars are being sponsored by the PACE Center at the University of Maryland in collaboration with our colleagues at the National Health Council. Today's webinar is on mHealth and examples of patient and community engagement. Next slide, please. The webinar today will be recorded and available on the NHC website after the webinar. It also will be available on the paid webpage at the University of Maryland website. Just to let you know, all attendees will be muted during the webinar and you are unable to unmute yourselves. Next slide, please. Just to acknowledge, the PACE Center is funded by the Pharma Foundation as a Center of Excellence in Value Assessment. And we are certainly grateful and acknowledge the collaboration from our patient stakeholder partners who really make the work we do possible. Next slide, please. I'm very excited to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Wendy Camelo-Castillo is Assistant Professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical Health Services Research at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. Dr. Camelo-Castillo holds a medical doctor, is a medical doctor, and has an MSc degree in physiology and a PhD in epidemiology. The goal of her research is to inform and improve clinical and policy decision-making by providing evidence of the benefits or harm of interventions used in real-world settings. Our second speaker is Ms. Angela Dobes, who works for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. She is a vice president of IBD Plexus, which is a research information exchange platform that leverages patient-centric approach to collect and integrate multidimensional real-world data to accelerate progress towards precision medicine and improve the care and patients living with inflammatory bowel diseases. Ms. Dobes devotes much of her time to advancing patient-centered research and is passionate about ensuring that research, care interventions, treatments are meaningful to patients. Next slide, please. The objectives for the webinar today are to discuss mHealth development and research with patient engagement. We're going to illustrate through case examples some mHealth applications developed with patient engagement. We want to also talk about the technology requirements and challenges of using mHealth applications, and also have an opportunity to discuss some of the opportunities for integrating patient-generated data to promote shared decision-making. Next slide. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to Ms. Angela Dobes, who will start us off on the webinar. Angela, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Susan. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Dobes, and I'm delighted to share how the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation leveraged a patient-centric approach to develop a mobile app to better engage patients in research. Next slide. Okay. First, I'm going to start with some background. So the foundation founded IBD Plexus, a patient data platform and biorepository to fill a void in the IBD space and break down data and research silos to unlock answers to the most important questions in inflammatory bowel disease and facilitate advancements towards precision medicine by capturing a holistic view of the patient experience, leveraging direct-to-patient tools to enhance patient engagement and research, and accelerating research that is prioritized by patients and includes patients in every step of the research process. Next slide. IBD Plexus is a complex network of parts that really works together to break down data silos and overcome healthcare fragmentation challenges through collection, integration, and harmonization of data at the individual whole person level. We do this to really advance research and across the entire product development lifecycle. Shown here is a high-level overview of the critical types of data, such as patient-reported data, genetics and omics data, and also more traditional real-world data sources, such as medical record and claims data. Connecting these sources of information together enables IBD Plexus to harness the power of the data and facilitate better understanding of these complex, heterogeneous diseases. IBD Plexus infrastructure was really built to incite beneficial and lasting change for the IBD community, where academic and industry researchers have the ability to access the data to advance their own research aims. Next slide. We have really big, ambitious goals to learn from every patient, and we want to because we really want to make sure that the research that's generated through Plexus is well representative of the entire patient population. And so we know that patients have different needs, priorities, and capacity to engage in research, and therefore we have enabled different recruitment mechanisms to not only meet patients where they are, but ensure that the platform is flexible enough to adapt to based off of changes and demands and even patient priorities, which really has been amplified in the wake of COVID. Now more than ever, it's really important to connect with patients digitally for research to really gain insights into their needs for new therapies. To increase opportunities to contribute to research, we launched a mobile app tool leveraging the MyStudies platform. Click next. Next again. And the MyStudies app is a digital platform that was really developed to gather real-world data for clinical trials and research studies. The app's main functionalities include the ability to collect self-reported data directly from patients and functionality to enhance the study's ability to link to other study-specific data sets. The tool's open source code enables organizations to easily configure the app based on study-specific needs. Next slide. Leveraging the MyStudies app, the foundation was selected to participate in a FDA real-world evidence program demonstration project through the FDA Catalyst system. The project is designed to help inform the assessment of the fitness of use of real-world data to support real-world evidence generation for regulatory decisions. Specifically, the project goals are to explore the use of a mobile app to fill data gaps, such as hospitalizations and ER visits that are not happening at the clinical site that's participating in the research, to capture patient experience data beyond the clinical delivery system, such as social isolation, to capture and also just in general to really augment study data collection to establish a more comprehensive picture of how medical products function in the real world, and ultimately really just assess the use of patient-generated health data, again, for real-world evidence. Next slide. Where I'm excited to share that last year, the foundation launched IBD Prodigy using the FDA MyStudies platform. We believe that patients are experts on their IBD and how their disease makes them feel and function, whereas it's important that we can translate that experience to be able to better define treatment value based on the voice of the patient. Next slide. Critical to enhancing patient engagement in research is conducting research that reflects the values, preferences, and outcomes that matter to patients. When launching any research study or designing a direct-to-patient research tool, experience, trust, and impact are three factors that are really top of mind to consider. When it comes to experience, understanding patients' expectations and aligning those expectations with actual experience is really important, especially when it comes to long-term prospective research studies. Patients don't want to participate in research if it's intrusive or inconvenient. Therefore, when designing data collections tools, convenience is a key factor. Also, life in general gets in the way of things. People are busy. For example, when we were doing some user research, we heard that a common preferred time to fill out a survey was just lying in bed right before you go to sleep, where the convenience of an on-screen app notification was easier to access than an email that might have, you might have forgotten which day it was sent, what time of the day it was sent, and really just to hit that home. It's a lot easier to just click on your home screen, click on an app, then go through scrolling through lots of emails to find that survey. In addition, personalization is really critical, where we are mindful to ensure that we don't send irrelevant or even insensitive questions to patients. For example, if a patient has an ostomy, we make sure that they don't receive a survey question asking them how many times they go to the bathroom. Next is trust. So understanding how and why trust is gained is also critical. So while the foundation's 50+ year history definitely factors into how patients perceive us, we have to continue to foster trust with the patient community when it comes to the research space. For example, we ensure that we leverage data collection tools that are secure and privacy preserving. The FDA My Studies app is both HIPAA and FSMA compliant. And then lastly, impact. When identifying success measures, it's easy to conflate outputs such as retention rates with outcomes. So when developing success measures, it's really important that you start with the impact and best align the why of participating with the benefits. Common impact themes that we heard included reducing the length of time of someone else's journey to being diagnosed and improving future treatment options. For example, while there are a lot of IBD drugs in the market today, for patients living with IBD, a third of patients don't respond to the initial IBD treatment they are given. In addition, even of those patients that do respond, approximately 60% lose responsiveness to those drugs over time. So in particular, this theme of really advancing treatment options aligns very nicely to the study that's leveraging the IBD Prodigy app. Next slide. So the study is called Spark IBD, where the overarching objective of that study is to identify predictors of response to IBD therapies and predictors of disease relapse among those responders, with the ultimate goal of really advancing progress towards precision medicine and facilitating access to that right treatment for the right patient at the right time. When a patient enrolls into Spark IBD, we give the participants an opportunity to share their preferred method to collect data. And if their preferred method is an app, then the patient downloads the app, and the app is used throughout the entire study to collect self-reported data, including symptoms, hospitalizations and ER visits, and medications, and quality of life measures, including things like PROMIS measures such as pain and fatigue. Data is collected at time of enrollment into the study, quarterly, and then whenever a patient undergoes a routine colonoscopy. For Spark, the critical event is change in medications, and therefore if a patient's medication is changed after endoscopy, they will receive another survey 3 months after their colonoscopy. The study selected questions based off of symptoms and quality of life factors that are really prioritized by patients. So when advancing trying to really advance progress towards precision medicine, we can also clearly define value of treatments based off of the voice of the patient. In addition, the more someone cares about the question that they're answering, the higher the completion rates are going to be. Next slide. Many of the self-reported questions were aligned to the most described IBD symptoms, specifically diarrhea, pain, urgency, fatigue, and bleeding. This then enables us to conduct downstream patient-centered research. This type of research enables patients' voices to be heard, assessing the value of healthcare options, and also facilitates characterization of the disease and the disease outcomes from the patient's perspective to, again, ensure that the patient's top concerns and priorities are being addressed. In the IBD space, the gold standard to assess disease activity is mucosal healing. And while it is a very, very important goal, it's also critical that patients' top priorities don't take a backseat or a back burner when selecting that right drug for that right patient. And to do this right, it's important that the scientific community understands how common are the most described patient symptoms, such as those shown on the slide, what patients have those symptoms and why, and how do those symptoms affect quality of life. Where the app is enabling patients to share this type of information in a secure and convenient way. Next slide. Understanding what is most meaningful to patients and collecting that information directly from patients is necessary to be able to define treatment value, again, based off of the voice of the patient, and we believe will ultimately drive short-term and long-term treatment plan success and compliance. When we think about how value is defined based off of the voice of the patient, the instruments and measures used across the R&D and care continuum are different. As a patient-first organization, it's imperative that the research we facilitate is reflective of the patient's lived experience. For chronic episodic diseases like IBD, the feedback loop between treatment and effect is very hard to capture, especially in between visits. And hence aligning these instruments and measures across the drug development and care is really, really critical. For IBD drug development, for example, the FDA emphasizes that the instruments have to be very disease specific. You have to clearly be able to elicit that outcome is directly correlative to the disease. Then we have clinical guidelines that not only leverage results of clinical trials, but also results from quality of improvement initiatives, comparative effectiveness studies, pragmatic clinical research, and the range of patient-reported symptomatic measures and quality of life measures can be anything that's disease agnostic, again, such as PROMIS measures like pain, fatigue, but also use very specific IBD measures. And then finally, formularies, which really drive a lot of these prescribing decisions. Currently, when ascertaining quality of life, HTA bodies, pharmacy and therapeutic committees, at least in the IBD space, leverage purely disease agnostic measures such as utility. So while there's not currently good alignment regarding how quality of life and patient-reported symptomatic measures are leveraged across the research and development and care continuum, as the foundation drives towards defining value based off of the patient voice and patient-prioritized symptoms, I really get excited about the role an app can play to not only help qualify a patient-reported outcome instrument, so that, let's just say, symptoms like urgency and pain can actually be on the label, but then how an app can become a vehicle for remote monitoring in a real-world population that can then help translate these patient priorities into value and quality measures that are used to drive formulary decisions. So that's my last slide, but thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Wendy Camelo Castillo, Assistant Professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical Health Services Research at the School of Pharmacy in the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And today I will be talking about the use of mobile apps and also wearable devices to support treatment in youth with mood disorders. Next slide, please. But first, I would like to acknowledge our federal support. We have received funding from the FDA, and the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of nor an endorsement by the FDA, HHS, or the US government. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. So before we get into matters, we're going to start discussing what is mHealth and how is it relevant to the study. I'm then going to give you an overview of what the MindPower app is and does, and of course, some of the ways in which patients have been involved in this study and what are some of the potential opportunities moving forward. So mobile health is a rapidly expanding field, and I think if you keep track of the news, it almost feels like every day there's a new gadget on the market that could potentially be leveraged for health purposes. But what is it in reality? And I like this definition of the National Institutes of Health because it refers to the use of any mobile device or wireless device that has a function of improving health outcomes, healthcare services, and health research. So as you can see, the definition is quite broad. And the real sort of launch of mobile health starts with the smartphone and, of course, tablets, because by making, in some ways, computers readily accessible to everybody in the population, or almost everybody in the population, with a large capacity to track, to measure, and to quantify different behaviors. Well, this has opened up the opportunity to develop applications that have potential health benefits. Next slide, please. But when we think about mHealth, I guess sometimes it becomes a very jargony. And so I want us to discuss some of the concepts that are going to be key to understand the MindPower app and the MindPower project. So as Angela mentioned before, one of the key functions of mobile health is the ability to generate patient-generated data. So when you think of how data was generated for a clinical trial, or how data may be generated for a study, or how data is generated, for instance, when you go to a clinical visit, typically it's very burdensome. It's based on paper-based questionnaires. People have to go through long questionnaires or sometimes diaries. And that may not always be aligned with the needs or the timing of when certain symptoms need to be addressed. So when we think about patient-generated data, at least in the digital health world, what we're thinking is about data that can be generated in real time, that is convenient in the sense of maybe the patient doesn't even know that the data is being collected, or in some cases, the patient is actively tracking the data and providing input to generate that data. But in reality, regardless of whether the data is generated actively or passively, this is actually what becomes the core. Patient-generated data is what becomes the core of digital health. And so here in the slide, what I illustrate is different ways in which data can be generated through wearable devices. Wearable devices are devices that are not based necessarily on an app, but that are additional, let's call them instruments or gadgets that you can put on yourself, or that you can put in your bed, or that you can wear in your clothes, that track different bodily functions or behaviors. The most common one probably is the watch, that of course has been used for a long time, mostly to track activity, but nowadays you can even get the electrical activity of the heart tracked through one of these smartwatches. But there are also other devices that are considered wearables, such as wearable shirts and wearable jackets that can track temperature, sweat, and other functions, or the rings that have become very popular because they're less intrusive. So all of these wearable devices have the potential to obtain measures that are not necessarily entered or actively entered by a patient, and therefore allow us to measure changes in symptoms over time. Next slide, please. So what is the Mind Power study, and why is this introduction in digital health and wearables important? Well, at the core, the Mind Power study is a study that aims to test whether an app and a wearable can be used together to be able to track changes in mood, sleep, fatigue, and activity among teens that have mood disorders and are treated with antidepressants. Next slide, please. And the reason we chose this population is because based on our previous work, and working very closely with community organizations and also with adolescents and their caregivers, one of the most common challenges that teens and parents face is that when a teen is started on a psychotropic medication, and in this case in particular an antidepressant, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether changes in some of the symptoms, for example, in their sleep patterns, represent improvements on their previous condition, or could be signs of alarm that need to be reported to the provider. And parents typically reported that there was a void because whenever they tried to have these conversations with the clinician, these conversations ended up happening 1 or 2 weeks after they observed such changes, and therefore they're based on what the caregiver and the teen can recall about their behavior and their symptoms. And this makes it very difficult for decision making in terms of, for instance, not only adjusting the medication, but also understanding if the child is improving or not. So this was the motivation to think about, are there better ways in which we can track these symptoms? And that's where we considered possibly leveraging the use of a mobile app alongside with a wearable device that could track physical activity and sleep. Next slide, please. So the research question behind the development of this app is, can mobile health apps and wearable devices, such as an activity tracker, be used to improve upon current instruments used to measure mood, sleep, fatigue, and activity in teens treated with psychotropics? And here, I want to clarify what we mean by instruments. So as you know, it's not uncommon when you go to a doctor's visit that there may be some questionnaires that they may ask you to fill out. And those questionnaires may help the clinician make decisions in terms of whether to change your medication or change your dosing. The challenge with these questionnaires is that, again, they may be only administered every 2 to 3 weeks, and therefore we're missing a lot of rich information that may happen in terms of how often those symptoms change during that time frame. Also, some symptoms are very hard to report. For instance, fatigue, right? And especially when you're being asked in the last 2 or 3 weeks, have you feel tired? like, well, you tend to average out and you tend to remember maybe the last couple of days, but that may not be representative of the former days in which you might have experienced fatigue. So we wanted to develop something that would allow real-time tracking of these symptoms. And of course, I guess at the background, the bigger question is, could this tool, which we think of it as the joint use of the app and the wearable, potentially support clinical practice and improve shared decision-making? And I would add to this that, could this potential tool be also used for regulatory decision-making? Next slide, please. So this is the justification behind the birth of the MindPower app. We responded to a research funding announcement from the FDA because the FDA was really interested in understanding whether wearable technologies could potentially be used to track symptoms and whether that information or that data could be used to inform regulatory decisions. And that's where this project sort of started. And overall, the goal of this project is to develop a pilot study that allows us a real-time capture on the symptoms that I've mentioned before, but also identify changes over time that occur, more closely than the ones that could be tracked through instruments in the clinical setting or in a clinical trial setting. Next slide, please. So what do teens in our study do? Essentially, once they meet the eligibility requirements, they download the app to their smartphone and they are asked to wear the activity tracker for 24 hours, meaning they wear it during the day and during the night. They are meant to be using the app and the Fitbit during a 4-week period, during which 3 times a week they will be prompted to answer questions that pertain to their experience around mood, fatigue, physical activity, medication use. So the measures that we use in the study are based on promise measures, both for the teen and the caregiver. So this is an interesting aspect of this because, of course, caregivers are also the ones that report to the clinician. But teens also felt that they needed, to maintain their privacy in the way they interact with the app. So in our case, the app has a caregiver component that is separate to the youth component, in which caregivers can also report based on these promise measures on changes that they observe on the child, but the child independently also answers these questionnaires and can report back in terms of any changes that they experience during that 4-week period. After 4 weeks, they end their participation in the study, and of course, we do some qualitative assessments to understand issues around usability and feasibility. Next slide, please. So how has stakeholder engagement informed the design and implementation of the pilot project? Next slide, please. So to begin with, we have an interdisciplinary research team, and this was something that we were clear on very early in the study, in that it was not enough to have, like the clinical expertise and the research expertise of the UMB team, but that we really needed to partner with different stakeholders that could provide all the various perspectives needed to address the needs of this particular population. This is why we, of course, partnered with our technology partners, HITLab, Health Information Technology Labs, who are the ones that support the development of the app itself. We have partnered with our FDA collaborators who have always provided input in terms of study design and sort of applicability to regulatory decisions. And of course, our advisory board that includes different members of the community, amongst those teens, caregivers, and other individuals who provide community services that are specific to this population. Next slide, please. So how have the different stakeholders been engaged throughout the study cycle? So on the left hand corner, what you see is like the different goals that we've achieved so far with the study. And each one of the columns represents the different ways in which the stakeholders have been involved to contribute to the development of the app. And as you can see, the advisory board was actually essential to identify not only the most appropriate measures that would be relevant not only for teens, caregivers, but also for clinical providers. And also to identify the outcomes that we were going to measure to ensure that this app was going, was going to be useful. From the FDA and technology support perspective, those stakeholders really provided more the scientific and clinical perspective, as well as the perspective from the tech side, whether we could actually implement all the things that we wanted from the community side or not. So as you can see, this was an ongoing conversation. There were a lot of attributes and characteristics that the community wanted, but for example, that were unfeasible to implement at this point in the design. Of course, in the subsequent steps, in terms of the development of the app itself, the involvement of the FDA and HIT Lab was more evident than the involvement of the community, up until the point where we got to the testing. And the testing was quite fun. We had involvement from other members outside of the advisory board, including teens, which of course gave us feedback to refine and get the app ready now for the pilot testing. And currently, of course, one of the main roles, not only of the advisory role, but the advisory board, but other community members, is of course to help with outreach and recruitment, but also to provide feedback in terms of the usability and the experience of utilizing the app. And we are hoping once we get to the manuscript preparation and analysis of the data that everybody will be involved, of course, in the generation of the different materials that we will use to communicate our findings. Next slide, please. So what are some of the opportunities, and I would argue some of the lessons that we have learned in terms of engaging patients and community members throughout this project, and specifically for digital health purposes? Well, the first is, understanding what is the relevance of patient-generated data. I think there's a lot of excitement with every new gadget that comes out that will measure a specific characteristic that somebody would like. But I think one of the challenges is like also, as Angela mentioned previously, that this is actually aligned with what patients considered as priorities and as relevant for their day-to-day life. I think the second big item is, of course, that we actually do need to develop better frameworks that are based on evidence that can provide guidance in terms of how to better design these apps and how to generate evidence that proves that these apps are useful. If you do a search through the Google Store or the App Store, what you will find is that there's a lot of apps that target mental health. But one of the challenges is that most of them don't have validated measures that, for instance, patients could take to their clinicians or that we could use for research purposes to generate evidence. So I think there's a big gap, and that gap, we hope in the coming years, will start to become narrower and narrower. And of course, there's opportunity to use patient-reported outcomes measures, and I would argue that we should strongly advocate to use validated measures. Again, there's a lot of measures out there, but not a lot of them have been validated, and therefore we don't know, if they can adequately track the symptoms or the outcomes that we're interested in. And by we, I mean everybody in all the stakeholder community. Of course, in terms of generation of knowledge, these types of digital technologies have, become a great opportunity to just generate measurements on the variation of daily symptoms. And I think moving forward, it would be really interesting if we could use that data to predict much earlier response to treatment, which I think is a big question, is not only for mental health, but it also applies to other settings. But this knowledge also, I think we have to reflect on is it has to be relevant for patient caregivers or providers. It's not enough to generate great data if it's not going to be relevant for the communities that we're targeting. And the last piece regarding the opportunities for engagement, what we've learned through our pilot project, among others, is that definitely developing technologies that have minimal burden on daily life is very important. And we had extensive discussions in terms of when should the notifications be sent, how many, even the colors, the fonts, the way in which the app, the interface of the app is designed. And even then, we still find that some subgroups within the pilot study might have challenges in terms of, or may impose challenges in terms of the way the participants interact with the app. So I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of how do we minimize burden and not increase burden with apps that are, very loaded in terms of their functions. But of course, here we're dealing with an interesting population because it's a dyad, right? It's the interaction between the caregiver and the teen. And there's always questions about what is the value of the for each one of them, and those discussions need to be had, I think, earlier on in the design. And of course, I want to bring forward the concept of digital equity. Digital equity has been discussed mostly in the space of access to internet and access to the devices themselves. But I would argue that there's other elements of equity, such as, are we designing technologies that populations that may have challenges can actually use? And so I will leave it there. Maybe this will start some discussion in our Q&A. Next slide. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And of course, I'm very happy to take questions during the Q&A.
Great, thank you both. Those are just really wonderful presentations, and I think a lot of great work has gone into the development of those applications, and really, so I have a lot of questions and thoughts in my own mind after listening to both of you. So thank you so much. I wanted to first turn it to, there is a question from a participant in the chat. Can either of the panelists talk a bit about the use of mHealth for the development of evidence for medical devices?
So I'm not a device expert, but I can give you a perspective from an IBD and biosensor monitoring. So again, inflammatory bowel diseases, most commonly Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, are chronic episodic diseases. A lot happens between the clinical care visit and just patients living their everyday life. And so an amazing opportunities to really collect all this wealth of information is apps. Again, one of the greatest challenges of IBD is being able to predict who's going to develop a flare. And in the IBD field, there has been some really nice studies that have showed how passive biosensor monitoring can be used to be able to predict flare in IBD based off of heart rate, sleep, and physical activity.
I guess what I would like to add is that I think there's two sides potentially to this question, because on one end, I agree with Angela. I think the ability to monitor in real time can inform how well certain devices are being used. But on the other end, what we're seeing also is a development of digital therapeutics, which end up being a combination, between sensors, medical devices that offer some therapeutic benefit. And I think this is an area that the FDA is very much interested. There's recent guidance that was made public, I think it was in 2020. And so I think what we're going to be seeing in the field is a more development around the evidence of this type of marriage, like the digital therapeutic, in which you have both the mHealth application and the device in one, because I think it adds to the complexity of only tracking, the performance of the digital device itself. Versus having sort of like a digital therapeutic that combines both. So I just wanted to add that because it could be also a different angle to that question.
Great, thank you. Yes, I agree with that. That's fabulous. I encourage anyone to put their questions in the chat. We have a few minutes for questions in this Lunch and Learn series. One of the things, we have a little bit of a lull here, but some of the things that came up during both of your presentations, I think you, Angela, talked about how the patient-generated data could actually really kind of influence formulary decision-making, and I think Wendy, you also spoke to kind of regulatory decision-making. One of the things that, since all of this data is being generated, how do you think that these mHealth apps can actually enhance shared decision making between patients and providers.
I can start. I think when it comes to collection of data directly from patients, in particular when you're trying to better understand the longitudinality of a disease and collect years and years of worth of data, it's aligning that value of participating to that long-term benefit is really hard. And I think one of the best strategies to overcome this kind of fatigue is really integration of research and care, and to your point around shared decision making. Let's just say you're, in this amazing study, and it allows you to have access to a dashboard and graphs that help you even maybe predict flares, and you show that to your clinician, but your clinician doesn't know anything about this app, doesn't want to use the data. I mean, that can be discouraging. And so I'm a really big fan of the concept of co-production and having this ability for apps and other tools to be able to facilitate shared decision making.
Yeah, I guess what I would like to add is that I think COVID pushed everyone forward in terms of having that now pressing need to integrate, digital technologies into care. And I think there were different examples. Like there's one, for instance, for obstetric care where pregnant women were being sent kits that they could use remotely to monitor, for example, their pregnancy, and they could also upload into an app any changes over time. And I think that's a really nice kind of way of thinking about how we can integrate. So it's not only for the purposes of research, but also for the purposes of informing, in this case, a relatively short-term interaction, which is only time during pregnancy. I also think that the biggest challenge is a financial one. Who pays for what and when? And because I do believe that patients certainly are more keen and potentially are at this point more knowledgeable, just because again technology is relatively easy to access. Not specialized technology, but I guess I would say apps in general. So I would say most people would have had some experience with some sort of app in regards to tracking something related to their health. And this sounds very ambiguous, but it's the reality. Now, the question is whether, for example, providers trust that data, right? And so I see that there's one gap there in terms of providers being confident that that data that the patient is providing is actually something that is reliable, evidence-based, and that they can use to make decisions. But the second gap is, let's assume providers and patients are aligned. And then the question is, okay, so if the app has cost, right, who pays for that, right? Or if it's not only the use of the app, is the use of the app and a wearable, who's paying for the wearable? And there are some pilot projects within CMS where CMS is actually providing the wearables to their beneficiaries, Medicare beneficiaries. But their pilot projects is not something that has been standardized. But certainly what I do believe is that moving forward, we're going to start having more of those discussions because from a preventative perspective, you could argue that it may be cheaper to deliver a wearable to a patient, have them track their health, and from the provider side, being able to track in real time, for example, a flare or a critical situation before it occurs, which would incur into savings into the health system. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but we still have a lot of gaps that need to be filled.
Great, thank you. If we are going to be moving in that direction, I think I might want one of those wearable jackets, and it'll be a fashion statement, right? We can have those look fantastic. So I am mindful of the time. We are at the time for this webinar. I want to thank you both so much for giving us that overview of your work, and I think hopefully it did generate a lot of thoughts and consideration, and maybe new ways of thinking about how these applications can be used to track and monitor health, but also obviously in the research realm. So again, thank you again for your time. I just wanted one final note that we do have next week our third webinar in this three-part series, and that webinar will be focusing on more on telehealth and health inequities. So thank you so much for everyone's participation, and we hope to see you at the next series.